Wendy Houstoun and I have collaborated for the past 10 years, and for most of that time, Wendy's role, if you like, has been as a writer of performance texts that I then use within the process with the performers that I work with.
My name is Wendy Houstoun. I am, I would call myself a performer, writer, maker of work. Latterly more writing, so increasingly writing, but sort of over a 40-year period I've kind of worked in many guises. I've worked with Vincent Dance Theatre for quite a number of years. In fact, I'm struggling to remember how many, really, because I knew Charlotte from 1990s, really. We used to share bills performing. I think initially I was very much inside the process, workshopping with the other performers. And then really, I think the more successful relationship that we've sort of developed is quite a remote one, actually, where I mean, we prefigured Zoom, to be honest, by some good 15 years. So I would sort of offer texts by email, but I would just kind of offer things that she could use, shape, reshape, tear apart, use a little bit of, use in their entirety. And they ranged really from, rhyming couplets to free-form prose, to edited sound, to music, to a medical report combined with a rock song. I will offer across a really wide range of conversational, intimate chat, declamatory rant, nonsense language in rhythmic form. For some of the words that I write are probably not even to be said. They're tasks to be done, or they're instructions for movement, or they're even ideas for the performer to arrive at their own text.
We have a remote collaborative sort of process where I might send her a bunch of ideas thematically, she might write something, or in the case of, say, Art of Attachment, I might send her a medical record, a poem, some reflections on what we're doing, and Wendy will then transform whatever form I send her into her way of processing and writing something. And she will then send her text back to me, and more often than not, it's just this gem of writing that has somehow integrated the themes of the work, people's voices, my thoughts as a director, and then she forms it into a piece of performance text, I would call it, and it comes back to me. I then read it, sometimes we tweak it, but usually I just take it to the performers and say, let's have a go with this.
I think the Art of Attachment was sort of quite a kind of, it felt like quite a leap of how we worked together, working with performers whose stories they were. So it involved me absorbing a lot more of the rehearsal and the way that the performers, or the people really, because it was sort of very personal stories, how they were thinking and talking and then responding within that frame. So it kind of moved quite dramatically, really. I wasn't totally clear what she had been doing, but she would send interviews, recorded interviews, that I would log and notate. It wasn't strictly verbatim, it wasn't just taking the story and putting it out again, It was kind of trying to get the essence of the story, but then lifting it slightly and turning it into I wouldn't say poetry, because that sounds a bit pompous, but to lift it into a thing that just slightly removes it from somebody telling their story.
And I'm in a dark room, behind a brick wall, inside a relationship, because I'm stupid. Look at me.
And yet really keeping to the heart of it. And sometimes it was about the form that the stories came in, or perhaps something came in the form of a report, a set of information that is it's telling you very emotional information about someone's life and the events that happened to them, but in a very medicalised way, with quite cold language and you're being emotional without trying to be emotional. You know, so in some ways I think the writing was always trying to slightly cool down the heat of the emotion and the heat of the events themselves.
Adopted, foster care, sexual abuse, race unknown, sexuality unknown.
Sometimes those texts become
Substance abuse,
direct address pieces of performance. Sometimes we use them as an impetus for more choreographic exploration.
history of self-harm.
The first time I sent some audio to Wendy Houstoun, she edited it on simple editing software and sent back to me an MPEG of some voices that were more loopy and mixed up. And that then kick-started a different way for me to think about how I work with voice in a soundtrack.
Your whole body just, I can definitely feel, it's like I become just a point in my head.
Wendy had been doing that kind of work with DV8 and Lloyd Newson before she used a similar process with my work. And in a way I have Wendy to credit for the way that I now work, which is to do the editing myself. Often voices from the early research are embedded in the final production soundtrack by Jules Maxwell, underscored by his music.
That keep asking you, alright, mummy. Going to the bedroom or the toilet or just asking, being on you, like, you're right, or coming back out, you're right, mummy, and that, like, not knowing what they're asking, really, what you're right about, just.
So there's a technique of capturing, distilling and editing and then embedding real life voices into the soundtrack of the work. I would say Wendy uses her vast performative experience to apply to the bits and pieces that I send her to write from the heart and from her brilliant mind to send back these bits of text that I then decide what to do with.
Stop. Turn corners, turn tables, turn tricks, turn heads, spin ourselves into care.
But it's a really important part of the process and it's very clean. She doesn't come into the rehearsal room. We do that privately and then I present the work to the collaborators. They're often really overjoyed with what Wendy sends back, which is a really pleasant part of the process actually.
Some sounds in the distance, or maybe in the next room. People were laughing and joking and drinking too much. It was raining outside.
I suppose in the same way that I'm interested in the fall rather than the leap choreographically, in the failure rather than the virtuosity of the performers, I'm also interested in the fragmentation of text and the failure of text rather than it being a neat poem or a neat monologue.
Why am I here?
Why am I not there?
Why am I here?
Why am I not there?
Why am I here?
Why am I not there?
The texts I kind of offer, I would call them vignettes, nearly. Vignettes or episodes, or they leap around in scale, in size, in volume, in intimacy and tone.
It's good to see you again. Let's maybe talk about where we're at, shall we?
Or an image. Charlotte sometimes sort of, this thing we were doing today where we just kept repeating this movement can evolve a rhythm for a language. So, the direction that the texts emerge from are so multiple, which I think you see in the work.
Move on to England, and while you're at it, quick, have a couple more relationships that make you feel even better, like nothing matters, or is it the drugs? That too, get high, stay high, forget, repeat. Get high, stay high, forget, repeat.
The main function of the language is to sit alongside something else or underneath something else, or maybe to fight something else that's happening on stage. Someone might be moving and the words are kind of battering them, or something very small is happening and there's a whispered text from afar. So they're always partnering, underscoring, playing with. There's a relationship. The visual element's very strong, the sound element is sort of there often kind of weaving through, and I think the text very much does that.
Who were they? These people with their files and their folders in their rooms without toys.
Talking and talking. What about them? How long were they there for?
I mean, because Charlotte's work is always very physical, she has a very strong aesthetic, I think. There's a kind of clarity and a straightforwardness, I often think, and yet there's a kind of, it's quite nuanced how she sort of brings one thing in, or sort of has an image that will go against something. There might have been a physical scene being acted out, and then the dialogue might work almost sort of slightly obliquely to it, you know, almost like you've taken the soundtrack of something and put it up against an image of something else. So you're kind of letting things collide. And I think there's a lot of power with language when movement's happening.
What could be possible is I was there then.
The poetry can be in the image as much as the language.
What might be the case is that I got from there to here at some point.
Something that works on a page
What I can assume
often doesn't work in a room, actually. So often it can be sort of, I'll write maybe quite a lot of things, and actually it might be one line or two lines that are really, that's the key, and sort of get rid of the rest of it. So surprised when I went back over the emails how much to and fro there was. Quite lengthy as well, as to the nature of, it's not verbatim theatre, you know, it's not just, I wouldn't say fictionalising, but just framing strong enough for it to sort of slightly move away from the person. You know, it's trying to lift the words a little bit away from them.
I can hear his slippers on the floor. I can smell him close by.
I think it has in common with a lot of dance theatre that people tend not to be characters. They probably, depending on the kind of work, sort of veer more towards archetypes or maybe a kind of persona. And especially with the art of attachment, which was very clearly the stories of the women on stage. I noticed in a lot of our emails was the sort of keenness to make the process therapeutic.
While she has reported multiple painful life events, she continues to affirm desires to recover, to feel valued, to be happy, and to love.
The things I was receiving, I was mirroring back but changed, you know, elevated or altered through a slightly different lens. I think especially with the nature of how delicate the material was, how difficult it is to build up trust, you know, within a group. I think it was probably useful I didn't see people, actually. I think it possibly allowed Charlotte some more room for manoeuvre. Certainly, I mean, if I'm not in the room, it's much easier to sort of kind of go, I hate this writing, let's get rid, you know, I mean, you're kind of more cautious if someone's there anyway. So I think the capacity to do what you like with the writing is there as well, if the person's not in the room. I mean, I did feel incredible responsibility to them. You know, the fact that these were sort of very direct stories in a way that the previous writing I'd done with Charlotte, you know, that it was much more about theatrical improvisation and more like playing games in a way.
We feel. We listen.
An ear to what we might be feeling, in and out.
Stop. Count the breath.
The strength of the piece did come from the fact that these were experiences of the people that you were looking at on stage. It was direct experience. I'm pretty sure you always attributed what you heard to the people that you saw. I don't think you sort of thought, oh, this is a you know, these are people channeling other people not in the room. So you were very aware that the people in the room were the people that experienced what they were talking about.